Chapter 9. The Bath. Hanyu's POV. Hanyu had meant to stay awake until Lord Antony returned from his battle. Truth be told, he was a little nervous, though he knew that was ridiculous. His god wasn't in any danger. Still, he would feel better when Lord Antony was back in his rooms, grumbling at him. So he settled himself gingerly on the sofa and prepared himself for a long wait. However, between the rigorous exercise of the afternoon and the heavy meal that was delivered shortly before his master's departure, Hanyu's eyelids were heavy. The hypnotic light of the torches didn't help either. He stared dully into the flickering flames, thinking slow, heavy thoughts. Hanyu woke to a hand shaking his shoulder. He had sprawled over the sofa, his neck and shoulder bent at awkward angles, his arm asleep, and a puddle of drool collecting on the cushion under his cheek. He wrenched his eyes open and blinked blearily up into the pale, drawn face of Bunta. "I'm sorry to wake you, Hanyu," the older man whispered, "and I'm sorry for entering without permission. I'll be very grateful if you don't tell Lord Antony, but you didn't answer my knocking." "I'm sorry," Hanyu slurred, wrestling himself into an upright position. Bunta ignored his sleep-addled apology. "The gods are on their way back. I've got servants preparing a bath for Lord Antony, but it would be best for you to attend him when he returns." "All right." Hanyu was more awake, but no less confused. The man was clearly very nervous. Was it so bad to be in the gods' chambers? "Listen." Bunta hesitated and glanced around the room, as if Lord Antony might be waiting to leap out from a corner and shout boo at him. "The gods are strange after a battle, unpredictable. You must be very careful, Hanyu. No mistakes, and keep all your attention on Lord Antony. You must not miss a single gesture or movement. I've never heard of him hurting one of his slaves, but if he were ever going to do it, it would be a night like tonight." Hanyu's blood seemed to chill in his veins. He thought of the strength in the god's grip, the way that the sword had dangled from his hand as naturally as if it was another finger. He'd always known that his master was capable of doing anything he wanted to him, but suddenly that power and his own helplessness in the face of it seemed terribly real. Lord Antony could hurt him very badly indeed, and there would be nothing Hanyu could do about it but plead for mercy, nothing to stop the god or lessen the damage, and it would take only a single moment of carelessness. The carelessness wouldn't be his, he resolved fervently. Tonight, even more than the night of his claiming, he would be perfect. He would permit himself nothing else. "Thank you for warning me," he told Bunta, levering himself off the sofa. "How long do I have?" "Perhaps 15 minutes," Bunta said uncertainly. "I have to go now. None of us wants to be caught alone. Good luck, Hanyu." The older man pressed his hand briefly, then was gone. Hanyu launched into action. He flew to the chest of his clothes and pulled out a flimsy cloth of gold robe that he'd admired before. He draped it over himself, then retreated to his closet and carefully applied makeup from the case he'd found under his basin. He streaked gold powder over his eyelids and carefully blackened his pale lashes and the rims of his lids. He cleaned his teeth, then painted his lips a deep bloody red. He affixed heavy gold bangles to his earlobes and hastily caught his hair in a fine gold net. The priest favored simplicity for the dress and ornaments of the offerings, but Hanyu liked bright colors and things that shone and sparkled, and judging by Lord Antony's apartment, so did he. Hanyu prayed he was right as he fastened a delicate gold chain, hung with tiny bells, around his ankle and scrambled back to the sitting room. Just in time, as it turned out. Almost as soon as he'd settled on his knees, the door to the hallway swung silently open. Tonight, Hanyu made no effort to peek up at his master before pressing his palms and forehead to the floor in supplication before him. "Welcome back, my lord," he said softly. Footsteps, not nearly as light and even as usual, thudded across the room. Hanyu's heart pounded inside of him. He wanted to lick his lips, but his makeup was too fresh to be disturbed like that. He wanted to drum his fingers nervously on the floor, but he didn't dare. He was frozen in place, suddenly unsure whether he would be capable of moving even in obedience to an order. "Well, well, well, little pet, aren't you fancy tonight?" Hanyu felt sweat prickle at his skin at the sound of his master's voice. It was lower and rougher than he'd ever heard it before, and there was a strangeness to his tone that Hanyu had no way to interpret. He kept very, very still. "Get up, pretty little pet. Let me see what you did with yourself." Hanyu forced himself to move. Warily, he pushed up to his knees, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered and his hands open, palms up on his kneecaps. It was a flawless waiting position. A sow would have gawked, and Father Shu wept with joy to see him so perfectly posed and deathly still. The god was next to him now, and Hanyu's breath caught because he could have sworn that no more steps had been taken. How did Lord Antony get over here? Hanyu knew he was fast, but was he really as fast as that? All at once he was hit with a heavy, salty smell. It was the briny ocean and something else as well, something almost tangy or metallic, a scent that Hanyu couldn't quite place, but which made every hair on his body stand at attention. His pulse jumped wildly in his throat. Pretty, the god breathed, and that heavy, musky stink was on his breath as well, and it was blowing directly into Hanyu's face because Lord Antony was crouching right in front of him. He didn't dare look up, but he knew the god's face was hovering only inches from his. Despite his fear, Hanyu couldn't restrain a shiver of pleasure when Lord Antony's fingers stroked slowly up his cheek. Pretty, 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 his master almost chanted. I need to take a bath now, pretty. Of course, my lord. Hanyu's voice cracked a little. One is prepared for you. That's a good pet, Lord Antony said in that same odd, frightening sing-song. Hanyu decided against confessing that the bath had not been his doing. Come along, little Hanyu. You're my attendant. Attend me. Thank you, my lord. I'm honored to serve you, Hanyu said. He started to get up, but the god was resting one slender, fine-fingered hand on his shoulder, and it was like trying to stand with the whole ship pressing down on him. No, no, pretty, Lord Antony said. On your knees. You're so very pretty on your knees. Yes, my lord, Hanyu agreed readily, his heart suddenly pounding from more than fear. Thank you. He crawled on his hands and knees through the door that had only been permitted to him once, when he was dragging out his cot in the shame of banishment. He didn't dare look around except to find the door that led to the god's washroom. He was achingly aware of Lord Antony's walking behind him, and he wished he could tell whether his master was looking at his body. He wanted him to be looking. Even if the god was strange and dangerous tonight, Hanyu still wanted his eyes on him. He tried to crawl a little lower, a little slower, make the bells around his ankle ring a little louder, and swing his hips a little more enticingly as he went. Unfortunately, he got tangled with his robes and ended up sprawling flat on the floor and knocking his chin on the threshold of the washroom. For a moment he lay where he'd fallen, his heart pounding. No mistake, Spunta had said, but then he heard laughter from behind him. It was the same high, shaky, gasping laughter as before. Hanyu could picture the way Lord Antony laughed, with one long-fingered hand over his mouth as if he wanted to stuff the sound back behind his lips, and at once the great bulk of his fear dissipated. God was strange tonight, yes, wild and unpredictable as Bunta had told him he would be, and he was clearly capable of crushing Hanyu on a whim. But it was still Lord Antony, his Lord Antony. The god was himself. He was still in some level of control of himself, and even if his behavior was a little altered, he wouldn't let himself harm Hanyu. Hanyu was sure of that. Hanyu righted himself and crawled the rest of the way into the washroom, the floor of which was paved in marble, much to Hanyu's surprise. The air was warm and heavy, and when Hanyu knelt up, he saw why. The center of the room held a metal tub, not nearly as large as the baths at the temple, but plenty large enough for one person, and the tub was full almost to the brim with steaming water. It must have been near boiling when Bunta and the others had brought it in. Even now, the metal of the tub kept it hot. Hanyu didn't know any words of gratitude that would suffice when he saw the older man next. Help me out of these, pet. The order was accompanied with a soft thud as Lord Antony sat heavily on the edge of the tub. Hanyu wasn't sure what exactly the god wanted, but there was no reproof when he reached tentative fingers for the laces of his boots. He worked off both of Lord Antony's boots. When he glanced at his hands after setting the shoes aside, Hanyu saw that the skin of his fingers had turned a dull, rusty red. He knew now what that metallic smell was. His stomach churned uneasily, and some of the fear leaked back into him. His master's hand, oh shit, the god's fingernails were caked so thickly with blood that they were almost black, descended on Hanyu's shoulder and urged him up with such careful, exaggerated gentleness that it was almost more frightening than roughness would have been. Lord Antony was clearly concentrating very, very hard on making sure he didn't harm his offering. At the god's indication, Hanyu untied the straps of his leather jerkin. Had that been his only armor? No, there was a sturdy metal plate set to hang over his master's heart, and its twin rested in the same place on his back. Hanyu set those carefully aside, then set to work on Lord Antony's thin cotton undershirt. It looked as if it had been white. It wasn't white any longer. The god lifted his arms over his head, allowing Hanyu to draw the sleeves up over his hands. It was a strangely trusting, childlike gesture, and it almost distracted Hanyu from the flesh it bared to his gaze. Almost. Lord Antony's chest was slim and dark, roped with small, coiled muscles and dotted and slashed with a surprising number of scars. His belly bulged in a way Hanyu hadn't expected. His nipples were small and peaked, and Hanyu forgot the blood on both of their hands in an overwhelming rush of desire to lean in and lap at those perfect dark buds with his tongue. He swallowed down the urge and averted his gaze. "The rest," his god commanded, levering a little unsteadily to his feet. Hanyu had hoped to hear that. He felt himself twitching and filling under his robe, and he knew that the flimsy fabric did little to conceal his excitement. He forced himself to ignore his body's responses as he peeled away Lord Antony's trousers, then his small clothes. In his nakedness, the god was more beautiful than Hanyu's most fevered imaginings had dared to make him. Even in his current state, he stood with an easy grace that was nothing like the grace of a sow, who always made Hanyu think of a soft, lovely flower, and everything like the grace of the terrible desert cats that could leap on a man and drag him into the shadows before his companions had time to cry out in alarm. There were more scars cut into the god's legs, but not as many as on his torso. He was so small compared to Hanyu, but it didn't feel like smallness exactly. His size made him seem compact and efficient, as though every bone and sinew had been angled to take up only as much space as required, and Hanyu felt sprawling and excessive next to him. His master wasn't small everywhere, though. His cock lay long and thick against the smooth muscle of his thigh. It was only average in size, but it seemed disproportionate against the rest of Lord Antony's compact body. He was perfectly soft and at ease as Hanyu perished with need before him. Lord Antony turned with a flash of dark flank, ignoring his offering's increasingly obvious reaction, and slipped into the water. He gave a soft groan as the salty seawater enfolded him, then ducked his head under the surface. And stayed. And stayed. At first, Hanyu was too busy folding bloody clothes and fighting his own body to be worried, but the moment stretched, and the proud silver head did not reappear. "My lord?" he ventured timidly after a long, anxious stretch of time. "A minute? 2? Nothing. The god stayed still." Hanyu stood and wrestled with himself and tried to keep himself still. It was all right. Lord Antony wouldn't live 1,000 years and fight 1,000 battles just to come back one day and drown himself in his own bathtub for no reason. He would be out any minute. The terror grew too great, and Hanyu snapped. He lunged for the tub and grabbed desperately at a brown arm, a pale head, heedless of the rusty water slopping onto his fine robe as he heaved his master out. "Lord Antony!" he cried, his voice high and piping with panic. "Lord Antony, please!" Slim, dark hands clasped on his wrists with a terrible strength, carefully restrained, and his terror-addled gaze met confused silver eyes. He gave a strangled little sob of relief. "Hanyu, what the fuck are you doing?" the god snapped, sounding almost like his usual self, and then he seemed to understand. One of Lord Antony's hands left Hanyu's wrist to spread over his face, where it failed to hold back his gales of laughter. Hanyu stood, bent nearly double over the tub and soaking, and felt his panic fading into embarrassment as his master laughed and laughed, still holding him firmly in place. "You thought I was drowning?" the god choked out at last. Hanyu nodded shyly. That set off another bout of mirth, but finally Lord Antony released him, and he stood next to the tub, waiting. "I don't have to breathe, boy," his master said at last when he collected himself. "I can't drown." "Oh." Hanyu felt terribly foolish. Of course that would be it. Why had he assumed what a god needed? Why must he always be so stupid? "Well, it was good of you to try to come to my rescue, regardless." His master grinned lazily up at him, and Hanyu could tell that he was still a little strange, still a little wild, but not as much as he had been. "Undo my braid." "Yes, my lord." Hanyu hurried to obey, and he felt his pulse quicken again when Lord Antony leaned his head back into his hands. "You're a faithful boy," the god murmured, eyes closed. "Take some of the green oil and work it in now. Yes, like that. Good pet. Tell me, pretty Hanyu, what would you have as your reward for saving my life?" Hanyu's heart leapt into his throat, and he found that his fingers were trembling as they worked in the god's thick hair. Was Lord Antony making fun of him? Surely he must be, though the god's voice was still dangerously raw and sincere. Well, if his master wished him to serve by being the butt of the joke, then that is what he would do. He would offer his own sincerity, as the god demanded. I only want to serve you, my lord, he said, and he could hear the aching want so clearly in his own voice that his eyes prickled with helpless tears. To be near you. If it is your wish to reward me, little as I deserve it, I would only ask to bring my cot back into your room. If you'll only tell me how I offended you to have me remove it, I swear I won't repeat my mistake, my lord. His tears were falling freely by the end of his speech, splashing into the ominously red-tinted water below, and his hands shook harder than ever. He pulled his fingers away from Lord Antony's scalp, afraid that he would tear out some strands if he continued. You're finely frightened of me, his god observed. Hanyu wasn't sure what this had to do with his request. Was Lord Antony simply ignoring it? Well, that was his right. Perhaps the god was even doing Hanyu a kindness, pretending not to notice what a needy fool his offering was making of himself. I was, my lord, he admitted, trying to drive the thickness of tears from his voice and knowing he did not entirely succeed. You were behaving very strangely, and I wasn't sure what you might do, but I'm not frightened anymore, or at least not too much. I know you won't hurt me. The god's shoulders stiffened, though he didn't turn around. I'm covered in blood, Hanyu. I killed more men tonight than are in your entire cadre. I know. Hanyu's words came out in a whisper. It was your agreement with the king. You were keeping your word. I liked it. Lord Antony's voice was hard. I won't claim to be more fearsome than I am. I don't like to make them suffer either fear or pain, but I like the hunt and the kill. You wouldn't like killing me, Hanyu said, and only as he said the words did he realize how certain he was of their truth. The god snorted, and Hanyu couldn't keep down a shaky grin. Even if you wanted to for a moment, you never would, my lord. You take good care of your things, and I'm yours. Lord Antony was quiet in the bath for a long moment. Hanyu stayed behind him, still crying a little, but his tears were less raw and helpless now, even though his request hadn't been granted. Instead of feeling desperate anymore, he simply felt at peace, and the tears were a release for all the powerful emotions that had been rioting through his body. I'd thought before tonight I would enjoy you being afraid of me, the god said finally. I didn't. I suppose I'm used to your obnoxious ways already, brat. The epithet was delivered without venom, and Hanyu received it with only a small, secret smile and more painless tears. There was another moment of silence, which felt almost like hesitation. Then the god said, In particular, I do not enjoy that you dressed like that and made up your face out of fear. I don't want you beautifying yourself because you're afraid I'll hurt you if you don't. That's not why I did it, Hanyu replied. Then, remembering his desperate scramble and determined to be honest, well, not entirely. It might be vain of me, but I like wearing pretty things and nice makeup. And I still want... Lord Antony stood abruptly, rust-tinged water cascading over his shoulders and drumming noisily into the metal tub. Hanyu jumped a little at the movement, but he couldn't stop his eyes from traveling hungrily over his god's wet, naked form as it gleamed in the torchlight. You are right, Lord Antony said. His voice was brisk and flat and almost his own again. I'm not going to kill you, so don't act out of fear of that. Now get my towel. Hanyu sprang away to retrieve the length of fluffy cloth and handed it to his master, who dried himself quickly, then wrapped it around his waist and stepped from the tub. Damn it, Hanyu was hard again, and his wet robes did nothing to conceal the fact. He flushed. The god glanced at him, and Hanyu was miserably sure that he was going to comment on the protrusion at the front of his robes. You cry a great deal, don't you? He said instead. I do, yes. Hanyu glanced at his feet. Sorry, my lord. Well, go cry somewhere else. I need to get dressed. Hanyu bowed deeply, half in reverence and half to hide his crestfallen expression. Yes, my lord. Thank you for allowing me to attend you. Once he was back in the sitting room, he stripped the sodden cloth of gold robes miserably from his body. Would the attendants be able to get the blood-stained water out of them, or were they ruined? He supposed it didn't matter. The robes had disappointed him. He wanted more from them. He'd hoped... Well, it had been a stupid hope. They'd told him that Lord Antony never betted his offerings, and they would know. But when Bunta had said the god acted strange and different after a battle, Hanyu had thought... He hadn't thought that the god would kill him. He thought he would fuck him. Stupid, stupid, stupid. The rules would have been bent for a sow. A sow would have been welcomed into Lord Antony's bed, 1,000 years of precedence notwithstanding. For Hanyu to think he could accomplish the same thing was just ridiculous. His master must have been laughing behind the door, laughing at his stupid, pathetic slave who stood there with his cock pointing out and his ridiculous, ugly face all red and streaked with tears of longing and... "Well, don't take all night," snapped in a rascal voice from the bedchamber. Hanyu's head shot up. My lord? Hurry up with that damn pallet, Lord Antony demanded. Or do I need to carry it and you both in here? I would like to get some sleep today, if it's all the same to you. The cot was heavy, but even with its weight on his shoulders, Hanyu felt as if he was flying through the doorway.